I am Lauren Bennett, 34 years old, and for 6 steady years I've kept 2 lives running on parallel tracks that never touch the kind you only notice when the rails start to hum. The apartment I keep in Connecticut is a showroom, quiet art-neutral rugs, a table set for visits that never last long enough to leave fingerprints. My real home is 2,000 miles away, a sunlit craftsman where Dan fixes squeaky hinges and our son Miles tap dances in a dinosaur costume like joy itself. I learned long ago that peace often comes from what you hide, not what you show. Tonight, as I smooth a linen tablecloth that means nothing to me, my phone lights up and the sound in Dan's voice tells me the rails are finally meeting. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to script your life for you. I was raised to say, please pass the salad left, and smile when people leaned too hard on their opinions. My father made room for small kindnesses while my mother filled rooms with expectations you could feel on your skin. In our coastal Connecticut town, reputation was a kind of currency, whose name appeared in the charity pages, whose child made the right school, whose porch was always staged for company. Dad taught me that the truest wealth was steadiness. Hold the door, remember. Birthdays, fix the wobbly chair instead of tossing it. Mom taught me something else entirely. Success mattered most when other people noticed it. That tug-of-war shaped me, and I learned to split my life along those lines, keeping the soft parts far from the places where crisp voices carried. When I left for college, the rules followed me. The silences, too. There was a boy, once decent and hard-working, who thought weekends could be for pancakes and thrift store furniture instead of galas. My mother called it lack of ambition and called him often enough that the light in him went out. After that, I focused on work that felt true. I found my way into nonprofit marketing storytelling for causes that had nothing to do with seeding charts and pedigrees. Years later, in a noisy museum fundraiser where the champagne bubbled louder than the band, I met Dan, a software engineer who solved problems for communities most people forget to notice. He has the kind of calm that makes a room less sharp. With him, I could build something that didn't require stage lights to be real. Our life in Seattle grew in the ordinary ways that make a home, a scuffed banister smoothed by small hands, crayon suns, taped to the fridge, a backyard where the wind smells like tomatoes, and rain. Miles loves 2 things with the same open heart: Stegosaurus facts and a bright green tutu from dance class that he spins in until he falls down laughing. We take pictures on the front steps and never print them large because printing them large might mean explaining them later. When my mother flew out for business every few months, I met her in that neutral apartment back east, poured the nice wine and answered questions in the narrow hallway between polite and honest. It is possible to keep peace this way, but only by splitting yourself in half. The difference between my world and the one I grew up in shows up in small comparisons. Our kitchen table is nicked from science projects and birthday candles, while the table at my mother's house looks like a magazine. Our neighbors knock with extra muffins and crooked smiles, while guests at her parties travel in polished herds and speak in careful looping stories that end at the word prestige. I know how to move in both rooms, but I breathe easier in only one. Keeping the distance required details separate addresses, a pared-down wardrobe tucked away for Connecticut holiday plans, arranged like chessboards so the pieces never crossed. For a long time it worked because I worked at it. And because Dan understood without questions what it takes to keep a boundary when someone insists they own the fence. Even with the distance thread still ran between us, her calls on Sunday afternoons, the articles she clipped about schools and careers, the way she said my name like it should be italicized. She asked about promotions and donors, never about the small gardening successes Miles and I celebrated, or the way Dan learned to bake birthday cakes shaped like volcanoes. When my father passed, I brought a few of his things west with me: a brass lens he used to show me constellations, a notebook with shopping lists and doodles of our old porch little anchors I could hold when the air felt thin. I promised myself our son would grow up where warmth counted more than headlines, where being seen meant being known. I meant to keep that promise, even if it meant keeping secrets to do it. Tonight, the Connecticut apartment is prepared the way she prefers: hydrangeas, trimmed glasses, aligned, everything quiet, and I'm looking at a place that resembles good taste more than it resembles me. My phone buzzes against the table, and Dan's number fills the screen. There is a soft scrape in his voice I only hear when something important has shifted the kind of careful tone you use when you're about to name what can't be unsaid. He tells me Miles found my phone, says he scrolled to a contact with a word he recognizes from bedtime stories, Grandma, and pressed the green circle because 5-year-olds are brave without knowing it. For a breath, I can hear our son's chatter in the background, cheerful and unafraid, and then I can hear my mother's name inside my own pulse, steady as a clock. The line is quiet for a moment that feels longer than it is, and Dan says, low and certain, "She answered." The sound of Dan's words kept echoing in my head long after the call ended. She answered. That single truth unraveled 6 years of walls I had built carefully and deliberately around the life that finally felt like mine. I gripped the edge of the table as though holding it would steady me. The linen I had smoothed so carefully only an hour earlier now looked like a prop in a play I no longer needed to perform. I tried calling her immediately, but the call rang once before falling into voicemail. I dialed again and then again, but the line stayed closed. Each time I heard that mechanical silence, I thought of what Miles might have said in his innocent excitement. Dinosaurs, tutus, a big boy bed. Simple truths that painted a picture I had worked for years to keep invisible. The apartment felt hollow, staged flowers staring back at me with the same emptiness I had arranged them to hold. I grabbed my purse, glass crunching underfoot from the vase I had dropped earlier, and headed for the car without looking back. The drive home stretched like an eternity. Every stoplight seemed to hold me hostage, and every passing mile left my chest tighter, as if each second gave her more ground to gain. When I finally turned onto our street, I saw Dan waiting in the doorway. Miles stood beside him, curls untamed dinosaur shirt paired proudly with that bright tutu. His face lit up when he spotted me. "Is Grandma here now? Can I show her my dinosaurs?" he asked, bouncing on his toes. My heart lurched as I knelt down to smooth his hair, telling him softly, "Not yet, buddy, but she might be coming soon." Dan and I locked eyes above our son's head. No words needed to convey the weight of what hung between us. This was our home, not the sterile apartment I kept for show. The hallway walls carried framed drawings in every shade of marker. The living room shelves sagged with books. Miles insisted we read again and again, and the kitchen smelled faintly of the bread Dan had baked that morning. It was a life built with care, joy tucked into corners, not with cold arrangements meant to impress. For the first time, I realized the choice was no longer about protecting a secret. It was about standing in the truth of what we had made. The low hum of an engine pulled into our driveway before I could answer the thoughts pressing against my ribs. A black sedan, sleek and immaculate, came to a stop at the curb. I recognized the careful purr instantly, even after all these years. The door opened and heels clicked against the walkway, like a clock counting down. Victoria Hale had arrived. I stood frozen in the entryway as she paused outside, eyes sweeping over the house with cool calculation. Her gaze lingered on the flower boxes Dan had built last spring on the porch light with a brass finish we chose together at the hardware store. Nothing escaped her cataloging glance. When the bell rang, its chime echoed through me like a warning. Dan gave my hand a final squeeze before stepping back, leaving the space between the door and me as mine to hold. I pulled the door open and met her eyes. There was no warmth in them, only precision and judgment, as though she had rehearsed this moment for years. "Lauren," she said evenly, stepping past me without waiting to be invited in. She moved through the house with silent authority, her attention drawn to the family photos on the mantel, to Miles's rain boots lined up neatly beside ours. Each detail was a revelation she hadn't granted me the right to share. Miles, untouched by the tension thickening the air, darted forward. "Grandma!" His voice rang with delight as he wrapped himself around her leg. Victoria stiffened at the contact, then bent down enough to place a hand briefly on his curls. "Hello, Miles," she said, her tone clipped. Her eyes cut to mine, sharp and demanding. "And how long has this been hidden from me?" We led her into the living room, sunlight spilling across the hardwood Dan had restored. She stood beneath the frame of our wedding photo, eyes narrowing as she counted the years. 6 years of marriage, a child about 5, so all this time a secret. Her gaze slid toward Dan. And you? What is it that you do exactly? Dan met her stare calmly. I'm a software engineer with a nonprofit tech firm. She nodded as though filing the fact under insufficient. Her lips pressed together, but she didn't answer him. Instead, she turned her attention back to me. And you believed this was something to hide. The weight of James, my college love, flashed into my mind. The late-night calls, the doubts planted like weeds until he believed he wasn't enough. I swallowed and found my voice. You gave me reason to. My words carried more strength than I expected, steady against the thrum of her disapproval. Miles tugged at my hand. Mommy, can I show Grandma my tutu? And my dinosaurs? Victoria's eyebrows arched in faint surprise. Dan answered smoothly before I could. He takes ballet. He loves it. His calm voice stood against her criticism like a wall that would not bend. She scanned the room once more, every piece of furniture, a target, every frame drawing on the wall, an offense to her sensibilities. You've wasted your potential on this ordinary life, she said finally, her voice clipped as a blade. Your father would have been disappointed. Something shifted in me then. I looked at our home, not through her eyes, but through my own. The woodwork Dan had sanded smooth, the sofa softened by bedtime stories, the bright pictures Miles had drawn that made our walls alive. I straightened my shoulders. You're wrong. Dad would have loved this place. He would have loved Dan and Miles. Her mouth tightened into a thin line. For the first time, I didn't flinch beneath it. The tectonic fear I had carried for years slipped into something firmer, something like ground beneath my feet. This is my home, I said, each word measured and strong. My real home, with my family. Her eyes narrowed, calculating. The Hale name means something in Connecticut Lauren. What will the foundation board say when they learn my daughter has been living a double life? The threat dangled in the air, sharp and deliberate. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about her reputation. Before I could answer, Miles bounded back into the room with his one-eyed teddy bear. He held it up to her with wide, hopeful eyes. This is Mr. Buttons. He helps me when I'm scared. You can hold him if you want. For a flicker of a moment, I saw something unexpected cross her face, a glimpse of emotion before she smoothed it away and let the silence sit heavy between us. Dan stepped forward, his presence steady. Mrs. Hale, this is a good life. Lauren's done remarkable work, and Miles is thriving. You're welcome to be part of it, but only on our terms. Victoria's eyes darted between us, and then down at our son, who still stood with his teddy bear extended waiting. Her voice softened, though her words carried the same careful distance. I see I have much to consider, and apparently a grandson to become acquainted with. She sat stiffly, ignoring the bear still held toward her, but something had shifted. For the first time, she no longer looked entirely in control. As the afternoon light slanted through the windows, I felt the weight of the years of secrecy pressing against me. Hiding had protected us, but it had also kept us smaller, quieter than we needed to be. For the first time, I saw the truth of it, how the silence had cost us as much as it had spared us. When I offered dinner, it wasn't from habit, but from choice. You're welcome to stay, I told her, my voice steady, if you'd like to know who we really are. She hesitated, then nodded with cool calculation. Miles cheered already, pulling her toward the kitchen to see his dinosaurs. I knew then the storm had only begun, but I was no longer running. I was standing where I belonged with Dan's hand in mine and Miles's laughter echoing in the house we built. And as I watched Victoria follow our son, I felt the quiet certainty that this was just the beginning of a longer battle. That night, long after Victoria left our house, I sat in the quiet living room and tried to catch my breath. The couch still smelled faintly of her perfume, sharp and cold, clinging to the fabric as though she had planted it there on purpose. The family photos on the mantel felt heavier under her scrutiny, as if her disapproval lingered in the air, turning what once brought me comfort into something that made me uneasy. Dan had gone upstairs with Miles, reading him his favorite dinosaur story for the third time, while I stayed behind in the half-light, staring at the walls that had suddenly begun to feel fragile. I picked up the teddy bear Miles had dropped in the corner before bed, his one-eyed Mr. Buttons. He had tried to offer it to her earlier, his small hands stretched out with innocent trust, and she hadn't taken it. That moment replayed in my mind again and again. It was a gesture so pure, so simple, and she couldn't reach for it. I turned the bear over in my hands and wondered how many years I had done the same, extending pieces of myself that were ignored or dismissed. The next morning, Dan poured me coffee and didn't say much. His silence wasn't avoidance. It was space, the kind he gave when he knew I needed to sit with my thoughts before I could put them into words. Miles thundered down the stairs in his dinosaur pajamas, still talking about how Grandma had seen his toys. He didn't notice the tension that lingered, or maybe he did, and decided not to care. Children have a way of living only in the bright parts. At work that day, I called Paige. She was the only one who knew both my lives, the sterile Connecticut apartment I used for show, and the warm home in Seattle where my real life lived. I told her everything. The unexpected visit, the words exchanged, the threat about the foundation board. Her pause on the other end said more than anything. Finally, she said, "Lauren, maybe it's time to stop pretending. You can't keep splitting yourself forever." I leaned against the office wall, the hum of the copier in the background, and closed my eyes. I knew she was right, but the thought of cutting away the only method I had for survival terrified me. Pretending had been my armor. Without it, I felt bare. Over the next week, I moved through our routines with an edge I couldn't shake. Cooking dinner, folding laundry, sitting at Miles's preschool circle time, I did each thing, but with the sense that someone was watching, waiting for me to falter. I kept thinking about the way my mother had looked around our living room, her eyes noting every detail, as if gathering ammunition. I had lived so long with the knowledge of her judgment that I could almost feel it in the corners of the house, even when she wasn't there. Dan noticed. He didn't push. But one evening after Miles had gone to bed, he set aside his laptop and said softly, "She's not in this house unless you let her be." His words were steady, not demanding, but I heard the truth in them. I wanted to believe it. Still, the fear of her finding new ways to break into our life kept me restless at night. 3 nights later, I found myself pulling down a box from the top of the hallway closet. It was the one I had carried with me when I left Connecticut for good, papers, letters, pieces of my father's world that I hadn't been able to let go. I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp on, sorting through the brittle pages. His handwriting filled the margins of old letters, his steady voice reaching me across the years. One line caught my breath. "Victoria fears being forgotten more than she fears being wrong." I pressed my hand flat against the paper, the weight of his words pressing back. He had known her in ways I hadn't wanted to admit. He had seen the hunger beneath her control, the fear behind her pride. For the first time, I wondered if the power she carried over me was as fragile as paper, too, something that only seemed strong until held up to the light. The days blurred together after that. I went to work, came home, tucked Miles into bed, but each night I returned to that box, tracing my father's words and piecing together what they meant for me now. They didn't solve the unease, but they gave me a map, a reminder that he had left me more than memories. He had left me guidance, even if I hadn't seen it before. Meanwhile, Miles began asking more about his grandmother. His questions were simple when she would visit again, if she liked dinosaurs, whether she would come to his birthday. Each time I gave him vague answers because I didn't know what the truth would be. Dan and I agreed we needed to be careful, but it didn't ease the sting of watching my son reach for a relationship that might never be safe for him. One evening after putting him to bed, I sat on the edge of the sofa with Dan beside me and whispered, "She's already reaching for him." "You saw it." He nodded, his hand finding mine. "Then we set boundaries now, not later. We protect him first." His certainty steadied me in a way nothing else had that week. But the quiet didn't last. A call from Paige broke through one afternoon while I was at work. She told me Victoria had phoned the office asking for my home address, saying it was a family emergency. My stomach dropped. The walls I had built for years felt thinner than ever, like one phone call could reduce them to dust. That night I stood at the kitchen window long after the dishes were done, watching the street outside, as though her car might appear again at any moment. The reflection of our home glowed back at me from the glass Miles's drawings taped to the fridge, Dan reading on the couch, the quiet hum of our life. It was everything I wanted, but for the first time, I wondered if it was strong enough to withstand her. I turned from the window, leaned my back against the counter, and closed my eyes. The knot in my stomach hadn't loosened since the moment Dan told me she had answered that call. I knew then that the silence, the secrecy, the way I had managed 2 lives, none of it could hold anymore. Something had to give, and the thought of it left me both terrified and strangely calm. The next morning, as I packed Miles' lunch and zipped up his backpack, I felt the shift inside me. The hiding had already cost too much. If I wanted to protect what we had, it couldn't be by shrinking from her shadow. It would have to be by stepping fully into the light, no matter how sharp it felt at first. And as I kissed my son goodbye at the preschool door, his small hand waving with easy joy, I knew I couldn't delay what was coming. She had already found the cracks in my armor, and it was only a matter of time before she pressed harder. I woke before dawn with my thoughts too loud for sleep. Dan's steady breathing filled the room, but my mind kept circling back to the confrontation in our living room and the quiet threat my mother had left behind. I slipped from bed, padded barefoot into the hallway, and opened the closet that still held a cardboard box I hadn't touched in years. It smelled faintly of cedar and dust, like it had carried the past with it all this time. At the kitchen table, I spread its contents across the surface in neat rows. Old photographs of my father, yellowed letters, legal envelopes that I had avoided opening because they seemed too heavy to face. The dim light from the window turned each page into a reminder that his absence never fully left me. My hands shook slightly as I opened one thick envelope labeled in my father's handwriting, "Trust, Robert Bennett." By the time Dan came downstairs, his hair still mussed from sleep, I had read through half the papers. He rubbed his eyes and sat beside me without a word, scanning the documents I had lined up in order. "What is it?" he asked, finally his voice quiet. I slid one of the pages toward him, the legal language dense but unmistakable. "It's irrevocable," I whispered. "The trust Dad set up. Once it was funded, no one could change it, not even her." Dan leaned closer, reading the lines with me, his hand brushing mine as if to steady both of us. "So she's been bluffing all this time," he said slowly. I nodded, feeling the weight in my chest lift just enough for me to take a deep breath. The years of believing she could yank the ground out from under me had been built on nothing but her words. The money was mine, free and clear, since my 25th birthday. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it, sharp and unfamiliar in the quiet kitchen. Dan's smile was small, but sure. "She doesn't have the control she thinks she does," he said. I folded the papers back into the envelope and held it tightly, as though the weight of them could anchor me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel cornered. I felt something else entirely: power. Later that morning, I dialed a number I hadn't called in over a decade. Ruth Camden answered, her voice warm, carrying that practiced ease of someone long accustomed to Connecticut's circles. "Lauren." My goodness, what a surprise. I hesitated only a second before asking the question that had been gnawing at me. "Ruth, what has my mother been saying about me all these years?" There was a pause, the kind filled with careful choosing of words. "She speaks of your career often," Ruth said finally. "The foundation work, the recognition you've received. But she never speaks of your personal life." I felt the truth land heavy in my chest. My mother had been using my professional success as currency, parading it among her peers, while erasing the family she disapproved of. "Thank you," I said softly, though my voice carried more resolve than I expected. Ruth's tone softened further. "Your father would have been proud of what you've built, Lauren. I hope you know that." I thanked her again, my fingers tracing the edge of the table as I ended the call. When I turned back to Dan, I already had the beginnings of a plan forming. "We invite her here," I said. His brow furrowed. Here again, I nodded. "Not for dinner, not for show, just breakfast. At this table with our life on display. No hiding." An hour later, Victoria arrived punctual as always, dressed in a tailored suit that looked too formal against the morning light spilling through our windows. She took the seat I offered her, posture perfect, her eyes scanning the walls as though they might betray me. I slid the trust documents across the table without preamble. "I've read Dad's papers," I said evenly. "You have no say in my inheritance." Her eyes flicked down, then back up, a brief tremor in her carefully constructed calm. "That was never my primary concern," she said, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. I met her gaze without flinching. I didn't hide because I was ashamed. I continued. "I hid because I knew you would try to destroy what I built, just like you did before." The silence stretched, her lips pressed tight, her eyes cold and measuring. I thought of James, the boy I had loved in college, and how she had chipped away at him until there was nothing left. The memory lent my voice strength. "You called his apartment every night. You told his mother he wasn't good enough for me. You made him believe he would never measure up." Dan stayed by the counter, quiet, but present, a steady witness to the words I had never said out loud before. My mother's hands rested on the edge of the papers, perfectly still, except for a faint tremble. For perhaps the first time in my adult life, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. The sound of small feet pattering on the stairs broke the moment. Miles appeared in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Good morning, everybody," he announced, brightly, climbing into my lap without hesitation. He looked at his grandmother curiously. "Did you see my dinosaurs yet?" "Grandma?" Victoria looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Not yet," she said, her tone softer than I expected. Dan poured her another cup of coffee, his movement steady. She accepted it with a quiet nod. Then my phone buzzed on the counter, and I recognized Ruth's name. I answered on speaker. "Lauren, I just wanted to check if your mother made it safely. Everyone at the club was so delighted when she mentioned she'd found you and your lovely family." I caught Victoria's eyes across the table. The timing of Ruth's call wasn't lost on either of us. "Yes, she's right here," I replied calmly. "Would you like to speak with her?" For the first time, my mother's composure faltered. She took the phone instantly, slipping into her social voice. "Ruth, yes, I'm having breakfast with Lauren, and with my grandson." When she handed the phone back, something in her had shifted. The mask was still there, but it wasn't flawless anymore. She watched Miles chatter about his dinosaur drawings with a look I couldn't quite place. Perhaps she said finally, her words careful, "I could stay a little longer, to get to know him." I nodded, my heart steady. He would like that. "We have pancakes on Sundays." Her expression revealed nothing more, but I felt the ground beneath us shift again. The bluff had been called, the leverage undone, and for the first time, I wasn't shrinking in her presence. I was standing in the truth of my life, with my son in my lap and my husband by my side. And as she lingered over her coffee, I understood that what lay ahead wasn't just a confrontation. It was the beginning of a new kind of battle, one that wouldn't be fought with secrets anymore, but with clarity. After breakfast with my mother, after the papers were put away and the coffee cups rinsed, I felt a shift that was hard to put into words. The bluff had been called. She knew it, and I knew it. Yet the relief of that realization gave way almost immediately to a sharper awareness she would not stop with one failed attempt. She had lived too long with control, and control does not slip easily from her hands. Dan and I spent the following evenings at the kitchen table, the space once reserved for dinner or coloring pages, now turned into a kind of command center. We spread out calendars, notes, even sticky tabs marking moments that mattered. He opened his laptop to a document we began calling the Family Preservation Plan. It wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about distance. It was about creating something stronger than secrecy, a way to protect what we had built without hiding. "First, Miles," Dan said, fingers tapping on the keys. "Any boundaries with your mother have to start with him." I nodded, thinking of the way she had eyed him in the living room, calculating possibilities behind her gaze. No unsupervised visits, no surprise pickups from school. If she wants a relationship, it has to be on our terms. Dan typed each point carefully, his brow furrowed. I added, "and consistent language. Miles should know his grandmother loves him, but we'll be the ones to set expectations. We can't have her planting seeds that confuse him." My voice steadied as I spoke each word, building a framework where before there had been only fear. The next section was harder, what to do about her threats toward the foundation board, her subtle suggestions that she could still tarnish what I had worked for professionally. Dan leaned back, arms crossed. "You've done everything on your own merit. Even if she tries, the truth is on your side. But we prepare anyway." He was right. I made notes about reaching out to board members directly, not with defensive explanations, but with updates on projects with proof of the work I had accomplished. Quiet transparency, the kind that leaves little room for gossip. Through it all, Miles buzzed around us, building towers of blocks, racing plastic dinosaurs across the table before bedtime. Sometimes he'd stop and ask what we were doing, and we'd tell him simply, "Planning for your birthday party." That part was true, and it gave our long evenings a softer edge. His 5th birthday was only weeks away, and Dan was determined to build him an obstacle course in the backyard. "If she's going to show up," he said one night, glancing at me over the rim of his coffee mug, "then let her see us as we are. Not staged, not hidden." The more we planned, the more the birthday became something larger than a celebration. It was shaping into a boundary line, a moment where we would show her clearly and publicly what family meant to us. But even as our plan grew, so did the unease. Late one afternoon, I received a call from Donna Taylor, the director at Miles's preschool. Her voice was careful, the kind of careful that immediately put me on edge. "Lauren, I just wanted to confirm something with you," she said. "Your mother has called the school several times this week asking about Miles' schedule, his teachers, even the names of his friends' parents." I felt my grip on the phone tighten. "You didn't give her anything, did you?" "Of course not," Donna assured me. "She's not on the authorized list, but I thought you should know." After I hung up, I stood in the quiet of my office, the sound of children laughing faintly from outside the window. It was no longer just about me. She was reaching for him directly. That evening, when I told Dan, his expression hardened. "She's probing for weak spots," he said. "We can't just defend, we need to close every gap." Together we called the school and tightened security procedures, adding extra layers of identification for pickup. We reached out to the parents of Miles' closest friends, explaining only what was necessary, asking them to be mindful if an unfamiliar figure started asking questions. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. The weight of it pressed on me late at night when the house was quiet. I would stand by the window in the kitchen, staring out at the backyard, where the swing set swayed gently in the wind, and wonder how far she was willing to go. But then I would remember Miles's laughter on the slide, the way his hand fit into mine, and the fear would turn into resolve. We decided that inviting Ruth to the birthday party would be another form of protection. If my mother tried to turn the day into another performance for her image, at least Ruth would be there as a witness who knew the truth. When I called her, she agreed without hesitation. "I'd be honored," she said, her voice firm, "and I think it's about time someone stood beside you when she tries her games." The weeks leading up to the party passed in a blur of errands and strategy. Balloons were ordered, cake flavors, debated invitations, sent to classmates. Dan built the obstacle course piece by piece, Miles trailing behind him with a plastic hammer eager to help. In the evenings after Miles was asleep, Dan and I returned to the kitchen table, reviewing our plan. Each step, each possibility laid out carefully. Yet even with all the preparation, I knew there was no way to predict what she might do. That thought followed me like a shadow, but it no longer paralyzed me. It simply reminded me why the planning mattered. The night before the party, I tucked Miles into bed and smoothed the blanket over his small body. He looked up at me with shining eyes. "Will Grandma come tomorrow?" he asked. I hesitated only a second. "Yes," I said softly, "but remember, your birthday is about you, about your dinosaurs and your friends and all the things you love." He nodded satisfied before rolling over with Mr. Buttons clutched tightly to his chest. Downstairs, Dan and I stood by the window looking out at the yard strung with lights, the tables set with colorful cloths. "Everything's ready," he said. I leaned against him, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest, as ready as it can be. The golden glow of the lights outside softened the fear that still curled in my stomach. "She thinks she's been gathering information," I whispered almost to myself. Dan's arm tightened around me. "She doesn't know what she's walking into." And as we stood there, the quiet night holding its breath around us, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, but we were no longer hiding. We were prepared. The morning of Miles' birthday dawned clear and bright sunlight streaming across the backyard we had spent weeks preparing. Balloons bobbed against the fence posts, and the tables were set with colorful cloths patterned in dinosaurs. Dan had finished the obstacle course late the night before, stringing pool noodles and hoops across the grass, and Miles had already tested it twice before the guests arrived, his cape fluttering as he leapt from one station to the next. Neighbors came carrying dishes, children in paper crowns chased one another across the yard, and for a while the air was filled with nothing but laughter. I moved among them with trays of lemonade, watching the happiness on my son's face. For a brief stretch of time I let myself believe it might be only a party, not a battleground. But at precisely 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I knew it would be her. Dan and I exchanged a look, then I walked to the front door. Victoria stood on the porch in a pale suit, her silver hair swept neatly into place. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood my grandparents Eleanor and Joseph Bennett, people I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. My throat closed at the sight of them. "Lauren, darling," Victoria said with practiced warmth. "Look who I found. They were desperate to see you." My grandmother's eyes brimmed with tears as she reached for me, whispering, "You look so much like Robert." Behind her, my grandfather's weathered face softened with recognition. I stepped aside, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Please come in. The party's in the backyard." Victoria's eyes flicked past me to the living room, cataloging the photos on the walls, the toys by the sofa. I could feel her calculation in every measured glance. When we walked out together, parents from Miles's school turned to look, curiosity flickering in their faces. To them it must have looked like a touching reunion. But I felt the trap she had set, forcing me to accept her terms or risk appearing cruel in front of everyone. Miles spotted us from across the yard and ran forward, his paper crown askew. "Who are they?" he asked, tugging on Dan's sleeve. Dan crouched beside him, his voice gentle. "These are your great-grandparents, Miles. They're Grandpa Robert's mom and dad." Miles's eyes lit up with wonder. "From the pictures, the ones in heaven with the stars." My grandfather's face crumpled, and I saw my father in him so vividly it nearly broke me. Dan extended his hand. "I'm Dan, Lauren's husband. It's wonderful to meet you both." My grandmother clasped his hand in both of hers. "You have a beautiful family," she said, her voice unsteady. Victoria cut in smoothly. "And what better occasion for a family reunion than a child's birthday?" Her words carried the air of generosity, but I recognized the maneuver. Before I could respond, Ruth's familiar laugh floated across the yard. She walked toward us in a lavender pantsuit, smiling easily. "What a wonderful surprise to see Eleanor and Joseph here," she said warmly. I couldn't resist joining when Lauren invited me. Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment before recovering, but the balance had shifted. I silently thanked Ruth for her timing. Miles tugged my grandmother's hand. "Come see my drawings inside." I made a whole dinosaur family. They followed him willingly, their faces softened by wonder. Watching them go, I felt a pang for all the years that could have been different. The party carried on around us. Parents mingled, children ran across the obstacle course, and the scent of grilled food hung in the warm air. But under the laughter was a current of tension. I could feel my mother watching, waiting for her moment. That moment came when Dan brought out the cake, a homemade dinosaur creation with green frosting ridges. As everyone gathered around, Victoria stood and smoothed her suit. Perhaps before the cake Oliver might open my gift, she announced, her voice carrying easily across the yard. Every head turned toward her. She handed Miles a box wrapped in cream paper with a gold ribbon. He tore it open eagerly, revealing a velvet case and a sealed envelope. Inside the case lay a small gold key. He held it up, puzzled. "What's this?" "It's your future," she said, her voice rich with satisfaction. "I've established an educational trust for you. It will cover tuition at Whitfield Academy and later at Yale, just as your grandfather and mother were meant to attend." The yard fell silent, the weight of her declaration hanging in the air. Parents shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what they were witnessing. My mother's eyes glowed with triumph, certain she had reclaimed the narrative. I stepped forward, my hand resting on Miles's shoulder. "That's very generous," I said evenly, my voice carrying across the tables. but we'll have to decline." Her smile faltered. "Lauren, this isn't the time." It's exactly the time, I interrupted, my tone firm but calm. Miles's future is for his parents to plan. We've already established a fund for his education. He'll go to schools where his individuality is valued, wherever that may be. The murmurs among the parents grew stronger, nods of understanding visible in their faces. Dan moved to stand beside me, steady and unshaken. Ruth positioned herself near my grandparents, her presence a quiet reinforcement. I reached under the table and lifted a package I had prepared days earlier. "And I have something for you, Mom." For the first time in years, I saw genuine surprise flicker across her face. She unwrapped the package carefully, revealing my father's brass telescope. Her hands trembled as she touched the polished metal. "Robert's telescope," she whispered. I placed a leather-bound journal beside it. His writings. He didn't dream of society galas or board positions. He dreamed of a life filled with meaning. That's what he wanted for me, and that's what I've built. My grandmother rose slowly, placing her hand on the telescope. Robert treasured this. He would spend hours showing Lauren the constellations. My grandfather's voice followed, rough with age. "Our son never cared for appearances. He cared about seeing things clearly." The shift in the yard was palpable. The parents who had come for cake and games now stood in respectful silence. The telescope gleamed in my mother's lap, her carefully constructed mask cracking as emotion bled through. For the first time, I saw her not as untouchable, but as human. Miles clapped his hands suddenly. "Cake time. Grandma, you get the first piece." Laughter rippled through the gathering, the tension easing in a wave. Dan brought the cake forward, candles flickering, and the children sang with bright voices. As I met my mother's gaze across the table, the telescope in her hands, I felt the truth settle firmly inside me. The years of hiding were over. The lines had been drawn not with secrecy, but with clarity. And though I knew the struggle was not finished, the balance had shifted. From that day forward, we would no longer live in her shadow. The candles on the cake glowed warmly, their light flickering across the brass telescope that rested in my mother's lap. Miles leaned against her side, proudly pointing out the frosting ridges shaped like dinosaur scales. Around us, the parents from his school clapped as he blew out the flames, their voices mingling with laughter and applause. It was a moment that should have been only about my son, yet layered beneath the celebration was a quiet acknowledgement that something much larger had shifted. After the cake was cut and passed around, Miles bounded between tables, showing off his crown and offering bites of frosting to his friends. My grandparents sat beneath the shade of the maple tree, speaking quietly with Ruth. Their eyes followed Miles with a tenderness that ached to watch. They had been kept from me for so long, and now they were discovering not only their granddaughter's life, but a great-grandchild as well. Victoria remained at the center of it all, her usual command softened by the telescope balanced in her hands. For once, she didn't direct the conversation or orchestrate introductions. Instead, she seemed almost tentative, watching the flow of laughter and chatter with an unfamiliar stillness. I saw parents glance toward me with subtle smiles, small gestures of solidarity that made me feel less alone than I had in years. Later, as the sun began to dip and children started gathering party favors, Victoria approached me near the kitchen doorway. Miles darted past with frosting on his cheeks, and Dan followed close behind him carrying empty plates inside. My mother's voice was lower than usual, stripped of its typical sharpness. "Robert would have liked this house," she said, her gaze lingering on the family photos along the wall. "He always wanted something that felt real." I studied her profile the way her fingers absently traced the brass telescope's edge. "He would have loved Miles," I answered softly. She gave the faintest nod, emotion so slight it was almost lost. For once there was no retort, no reminder of what I had abandoned, only silence filled with words unspoken. As evening settled, guests began to say their goodbyes. Ruth embraced me warmly before she left, whispering, "You did beautifully today." My grandparents promised to call the following week, Eleanor clutching my hand with a strength that belied her age. Dan walked them to their car, while I stood at the doorway, Miles perched sleepily on my hip. My mother lingered behind them, her eyes searching mine. "Perhaps," she said carefully, I could come again soon. Maybe not for a party, something smaller. The request caught me off guard, though her tone lacked the command I had always braced against. I nodded once. "We'll see," I replied, measured but not closed. She gave a faint smile, touched Miles's hair briefly, and stepped into the night. Inside, with dishes piled high and wrapping paper scattered across the floor, I sank onto the sofa. Dan placed a mug of tea in my hands and sat beside me. "That was more than a birthday party," he said quietly. I exhaled, the weight of the day pressing down and lifting all at once. Yes, it was the beginning of something new. The days that followed brought an unfamiliar calm. My mother did not call with demands or critiques, though her presence lingered in my thoughts. Instead, a letter arrived one morning in her careful handwriting, thanking us for including her and remarking on Miles's spirited charm. It was short, restrained, but it marked a shift. At work, Paige noticed the change in me. "You seem lighter," she said one afternoon, sliding a stack of reports across my desk. I hesitated before answering, realizing she was right. For years, I had lived in halves, constructing walls to separate one life from another. Now, for the first time, I was not hiding. One evening, while Dan read Miles a bedtime story, I sat at the kitchen table with my father's journals spread before me. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and ink, his handwriting looping across each entry. In the margins, he had scribbled notes about the stars he charted with that telescope reflections on family and lines about wanting his daughter to live free. Reading them, I felt his presence more strongly than I had in years. The telescope now stood on our living room shelf, its brass gleaming in the afternoon light. Miles had taken to calling it Grandpa's Starfinder, often asking if he could use it to look at the moon. Dan helped him one evening, lifting the instrument carefully onto the porch. My son's gasp at seeing the craters for the first time carried through the night air a sound of wonder, untainted by expectation. When my mother called the following week, her voice was different. There was still precision in her tone, but not the edge that once cut so sharply. She asked about Miles's new art project, listened as I described our work fundraiser, and ended the conversation without criticism. It was the first time in memory that I hung up the phone without a knot in my stomach. Yet beneath the surface, I knew the path ahead wasn't simple. Old habits do not vanish overnight, and boundaries would need to be held with steady hands. Still, I had faced her in my own home in front of witnesses and claimed the truth of my life. That power would not be taken back. Thanksgiving approached, and for the first time she suggested we host. The idea unsettled me at first, but as I looked around our kitchen, the fridge covered with Miles's drawings, the height marks penciled on the doorframe, the telescope catching the light, I realized it no longer filled me with dread. This house was ours, built with love, not approval. Dan reached for my hand across the table that evening. "So are we doing Thanksgiving here?" he asked with a smile. I thought of the years I had hidden behind lies, the sterile apartment staged for her visits, the silence I had taught my child. And then I thought of my father's words in those journals. "Yes," I said finally, my voice steady. "It's time." Thanksgiving morning arrived crisp and bright, the kind of autumn day my father used to love. The kitchen filled with the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon, while Dan kept Miles busy with games so I could finish setting the table. I looked around at our home sunlight glinting off the brass telescope on the bookshelf and felt a steadiness I hadn't known in years. This would be the first holiday I welcomed my mother here without fear or pretense. The doorbell rang earlier than expected. Miles rushed to answer, calling out, "Grandma's here." His excitement carried through the hallway as Victoria stepped inside, dressed simply in a soft gray sweater instead of her usual tailored suit. She carried a rectangular package wrapped in silver paper, her eyes moving briefly across the family photos on our walls. There was no criticism in her glance, only a quiet acknowledgement of what she saw. She handed me the package before removing her coat. "This arrived from the foundation board," she said, her voice measured. I unwrapped it carefully and found a framed certificate, the Robert Bennett Memorial Scholarship, established in both her name and mine. It promised annual support for young people choosing their own paths, especially those facing family pressure to follow predetermined ones. I traced the lettering with my fingers, the weight of its meaning settling in. "It's perfect," I said softly. My mother nodded, once her composure slipping just enough for me to see the emotion beneath. "Your father always believed in making room for others to find their way," she murmured. As more guests arrived, neighbors carrying pies, my grandparents with flowers, the house filled with warmth and laughter, Miles dragged Victoria by the hand toward his play corner, eager to show her the dinosaur village he had been building all week. She knelt carefully on the rug beside him, listening as he explained which dinosaur was the parent, which was the child, and which was adopted but loved anyway. Watching them, I felt something shift. The walls I had carried for years weren't needed here. At dinner, we squeezed around the long table, plates full and voices overlapping. Eleanor told stories about Robert as a boy, Joseph added gentle humor, and Ruth shared toasts that made everyone laugh. Victoria sat quietly through much of it, but when it was her turn, she lifted her glass with a steadiness I didn't expect. "To Lauren," she said, "and to the family she's built with honesty, with courage, and with love. Robert would be proud." The room stilled for a heartbeat before glasses clinked and conversation rose again. Across the table, Dan caught my eye and gave a small smile. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with gratitude. Later that evening, after dishes were stacked and Miles had fallen asleep in his dinosaur pajamas, I walked my mother to the door. She hesitated, glancing back toward the telescope in the living room. "Your father wanted you to see clearly," she said. "I think I'm beginning to understand what he meant." I stepped closer, the night air cool against my skin. "It's not about where we come from," I said quietly. "It's about the life we choose to live." She looked at me for a long moment, then reached out and touched my hand, just a brief, tentative gesture, but one that carried more weight than years of forced embraces. After she left, I stood in the quiet of our home, listening to the soft hum of the heater and the faint rustle of leaves outside. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for the next battle. I was standing in a life built on truth, surrounded by love, and strengthened by the lessons of the past. I've learned that hiding doesn't protect what matters most, it only shrinks it. Real freedom comes when we stop running and stand in our truth, even when it feels impossible. Family isn't about control or appearances. It's about creating a place where love has room to grow, even if that means starting over. If you've ever carried the weight of someone else's expectations, I hope my story reminds you that you're allowed to put it down. You're allowed to build a life that's yours. Thank you for listening to my journey. Share with me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever had to find the courage to choose your own path. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes the truest justice is simply living as yourself.